Recently in the news, you must have seen that there has been arousing issues in Israel and Palestine. West Asia has always been a burning topic from perspective of your examination, be it your international relations portion in GS and also your political science optional. So in today's lecture, we will be discussing about the recent burning issues with regard to Israel and Palestine, the Arab-Israel wars, what is the idea of intifada, what is the present conflict all about, and what is the stand of India. So my name is Anuj Sharma and we will be discussing in length Israel-Palestine conflict. So starting with the idea of Israel-Palestine conflict, what do we understand is that Israel is a very small country when we talk about the West Asia. So in West Asia, what do we realize? That Israel is this portion of West Asia which is being surrounded by the countries like Lebanon, there is Syria, there is Jordan, and on this side is Egypt. So it is a very small country which on one side borders the Mediterranean Sea and on the other side there is the Dead Sea. Inside Israel or along the boundaries of Israel, there are a couple of territories which is a very small strip known as Gaza Strip, and on the western side there is the idea of West Bank. So what entirely UPSC can ask from you in the examination is that in prelims examination there have been multiple times that the questions have been asked with regard to the countries surrounding Mediterranean Sea. That is, there was a question way back in 2016 and 17 that the countries surrounding which of the following countries are surrounding Mediterranean Sea. So you should know that the geography of this area. There was once a question that was asked that Golan Heights falls in which part of the world, as we will discuss in the further lecture that Golan Heights is an area which is falling on this part of Israel. Alright, so these kind of questions can be asked even in your prelims examination from the perspective of West Asia, because West Asia throughout, be it your Israel-Palestine, be it your Iran-Iraq, be it your Saudi Arabia, it is in news throughout the year. And when UPSC asks you, so there are full possibilities that in the concept of places in news, these issues can be asked. So from the prelims perspective, you have to understand this. Now moving to the status of the understanding, what we realize that how the conflict started in Israel and Palestine. Now, in Israel and Palestine, what was the primary issue with regard to Israel and Palestine and how the system began? So what happened was that Jews have always or was always a kind of a persecuted community. Since the initiation, Jews was a very minuscule or a very minority community and it was persecuted throughout the European world. Now Jews basically stated that the area of Palestine is their homeland. That where was Palestine? The area of Palestine was their homeland. This part, that is this part in which there is the present Israel, the Jews said that this area is their original homeland. And in the similar place was the existence of Palestine. Now Jews or this Jewish movement or the area of Palestine, their demand for Israel goes back to the understanding of Zionist movement that was started. Right, Zionism that was started and their movement goes back to that time. In the similar place there was the existence of Palestine. Now Palestine was a Muslim state which lied in the Arab nations, whereas there was Israel which was talking about the establishment of Jews nation or Jewish nation in the areas of Palestine. Now what happened was the significant point or a most important part of the world history where Israel kind of found their feet in Palestine was during World War I. Now in World War I, on one side, what did British do? British said that they will support the Arab rebels against the Ottoman Empire. As you all know that there was an Ottoman Empire against which the Britain and France were fighting in the World War I. So what did the Britain do? What did Britain do? Britain said that to the Arab rebels that if they help Britain fight against the Ottoman Empire, then Britain will help them in establishment of Arab nations. But on other side, Britain conducted a Sykes-Picot agreement in which they divided amongst themselves the areas of Arab, that is Britain and France in Sykes-Picot agreement developed this understanding that the areas of Arab nation after Ottoman Empire is defeated will be divided among Britain and France. This is a traditional or conventional British method. Now, the area of Palestine came under the jurisdiction of Britain. The area of Palestine came under the jurisdiction of Britain. On one side, where Britain was stating, or Britain stated to the Arab world or promised the Arab rebels that they will help the Arab nations establish a area. On the other side, Britain was also very much sympathetic to the cause of creation of Jewish homeland. Britain was very much, Britain was very much sympathetic to the Jewish understanding. And on the similar side, what Britain did, Britain announced Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration, what they said in Balfour Declaration, they supported the national home for Jewish people. On one side, they are saying that they will help the Arab nations, and on the other side, there is an establishment of Balfour Declaration in which British said that they will support the establishment of Jewish world. So, वही खेल जो ब्रिटेन ने यहाँ पे खेला, इंडिया पाकिस्तान, वही खेल ब्रिटेन खेल गया कहाँ पे, इजराइल पैलेस्टीन. So this is the conventional British method that they followed at that point of time. Now, post World War I, there was in Germany, as you all know, establishment of Nazi regime led by Hitler. In that Nazi regime, millions of Jews were persecuted, they were killed in the Holocaust. The heinous genocide took place under Nazi regime, under the regime of Hitler. And at that point of time, what happened? That there was a millions and millions of Jews who flee from Europe, and they all settled in Palestine, which was at that time Palestine, later on became an Israel. Now what happened? That at one point of time, when Britishers said, post 1919 or after Balfour Declaration, when they said that they will support, then gradually the Jewish population started to settle in that particular territory. But post the Holocaust, there were lakhs and thousands of Jews that were fleeing towards Israel, which led to the increase in the inhabitants and the population of Jews in that particular area. Now, the inflow of Jews, what happened? That the inflow of Jews led that the local Arabs protested. Local Arabs protested, and sir, protests even turned violent. अब आपकी जगह के ऊपर कोई और आके रह रहा है, देखो, इट इज ऑल अबाउट द फाइट ऑफ रिसोर्सेस. अगर आपकी जगह के ऊपर और कोई आके रह रहा है, तो देयर विल बी ऑब्वियसली अ प्रोटेस्ट बाय द लोकल पॉपुलेशन. एंड इट इज नॉट जस्ट सीन इन इंडिया, और it was not just seen in Israel, but it is seen throughout the world. Right, it is seen throughout the world. Whenever there are immigrants that come and settle, the local population protests. So there was a huge protest, huge hue and cry in Palestine and in the Arab world, that why the Jews are coming and settling down in Palestine, which was a part of Arab land. Now, what happened? That in 1947, the situation or the issue went to United Nations, and United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, known as UN Partition Plan for Palestine. It is a very important event in the history of Israel and Palestine. Now, in United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine, it was decided that there shall be a division of Palestine and Israel. There shall be a division of Palestine and Israel. And what did this resolution decide? This resolution decided, sir, that the division will be in three parts. One will be the Palestinian territory, second will be the Jewish territory, and there will be a Jerusalem, and this Jerusalem will be an international state. Now look at this map, which will make it further clear that this area, which is marked in this color, that is the brownish color, this area was considered to be a Jewish state as per United Nations Partition Plan. The area marked in this grey color is considered to be the Palestinian or the Arab state as per the United Nations Partition Plan. And this part, which is the Jerusalem part, this Jerusalem part is the international state which was recognized by United Nations partition plan. Now there is a lot of significance about Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem is important for three very important religions of the world. One is Jews, second is Muslims, and third is Christians. For all these three religions, this part or this area of Jerusalem is very much important, because what is the issue? That it is considered to be holy for all the three religions. For the Muslims, it is considered to be holy, is the third most holiest site for the Muslims, and it is where they say that after Makkah and Medina, where they say that the Prophet came to this part of world as well, which is as of now known as Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is in news throughout the world. Second thing, for Christianity, it is considered that here the Christians, the Jesus was crucified and he came back to life. That was Al-Aqsa, this was this place of Jerusalem. And for Jews also, it is very much a holy site. So for all the three religions, the site of Jerusalem or the state of Jerusalem is very, very important, and to incorporate the feelings of all the three religions, especially Jews and Palestinians or Jews and Islam, which were at conflict at that point of time, it was decided by the United Nations partition plan that Jerusalem shall be considered to be an international state. But what happened? What was established? That this was not accepted by the Arab nations. Arab nations said that we support Palestine, right? We support Palestine and we do not support this two-state theory, right? This is the two-state or two-nation theory which since the time of Pandit Nehru, India has always focused upon. We'll get to that as well. I'm just dropping hints for you that there is a two-nation theory which was established by United Nations partition plan and which was very well supported by India at that point of time. And as of now, India does not overtly support this idea of two-nation theory, but yes, India always says that there shall be establishment of peace for both the countries. But what happened after United Nations partition plan was that the matter did not solve, and British, sir, as usually left the place without any settlement, as they did in India and Pakistan. They also left from Israel and Palestine. Now which ultimately led to the first Arab-Israel war. Now first Arab-Israel war was basically because that the Israel land was established. Israel announced itself as an independent country in 1948. Now in 1948, the Arab League decided to intervene from the side of Palestine or on the behalf of Palestine. And the countries from all the sides are attacked. Egypt from one side, Jordan from one, Syria from one, they all attacked Israel. Now Israel was fighting for survival, and whoever fights for survival, sir, wins, right? So Israel was fighting for survival, and Israel defeated the army of these five countries, which was considered to be a very important point in the history of Israel, because Israel understood at that point of time that if they will not win now, their existence will be eliminated. The Jews realized this, Israelis realized this, and there was a war between Arab and Israel, and sir, Arabian countries were defeated. Now what it led to was very important, because what it led to was that Israel, which held the mandate and territory, Jordan occupying and later annexing the West Bank, Jordan undertook the idea of West Bank, Jordan captured the West Bank, and Gaza Strip came under Egypt. Gaza Strip came under Egypt. So if you look at the map of Israel, so what was there? This part is considered to be West Bank. Here there is West Bank, and this West Bank came under the Jordan, and this region is considered to be a Gaza Strip. I'll show you the map. This region is considered to be Gaza Strip, right? This region is considered to be the West Bank, and this came under Jordan, and this region is considered to be Gaza Strip, and this was occupied by Egypt post the Arab-Israel war. Post the Arab-Israel war, the West Bank area was undertaken by what we consider to be Jordan, and Egypt overtook the Gaza Strip. Now the war ended, which ultimately led to lakhs of thousands of Palestinians fleeing their region, fleeing their area, as the control of Israel further strengthened. What Israel did, that Israel basically also Israel also captured the part of Jerusalem. Now, on the eastern side, Israel captured the Jerusalem, which was considered to be the international city by United Nations partition plan. But sir, that was not accepted. So in the first Arab-Israel war, Israel captured this, and hundreds and thousands of Palestinians fled or were forced to leave, which is known as Al-Nakba or the catastrophe. Which is known as Al-Nakba or the catastrophe. Now, the Arab nations did not sit idle. Arab nations did not sit idle, and in 1956, sir, there was a very important event in the world history, which is known as Suez Crisis. In this Suez Crisis, what happened was that the leader of Egypt, Nasser, he nationalized Suez Canal. He nationalized Suez Canal, which was not accepted by Britain, France. Britain and France decided to attack Egypt, and Britain and France were assisted by Israel. Now, this war or this crisis ended when USA and USSR intervened, and this also explained to the world that Britain and France are no more the major powers or the bigger powers. It is the USA and USSR which are deciding the events of the world history. Now, post this Suez Crisis, what happened was that Jordan and Syria signed an agreement, a mutual defense pact to strengthen their defense forces. And in 1967, what happened that there were secret meetings going on between Jordan and Syria, and Israel realized something is fishy, and Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria and Jordan. Now, this war is known as Six-Day War, and in Six-Day War, what was most historic was that Israel, sir, captured Golan Heights, which was earlier with Syria. Israel captured West Bank and East Jerusalem, which was earlier with Jordan, and Israel captured Egyptian part of Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. And Gaza and West Bank were together known as occupied territories after 1967 war. So the areas which were under Egypt were captured by Israel. The areas with Syria were captured by Israel. The areas were Jordan were also captured by Israel. That is why I was telling you earlier in the starting of the lecture, the question that was asked by UPSC with regard to Golan Heights as well. So this was the result of Six-Day War. So if we look at the map, then we will realize that this is before 1967 war. This is before 1967 war. This is Jordan, this is Israel, this is Egypt. Now, this area of Gaza and this area of Sinai Peninsula was taken up by Israel or was captured by Israel after the Six-Day War, and this area of West Bank was captured by Israel from the Jordan, and this area of Golan Heights was captured by Israel from the side of Syria. This is the before 1967 map, and this is the after 1967 map. This is Sinai Peninsula, this is Gaza Strip, this is West Bank, and this is Golan Heights. So the area of Israel expanded post 1967 war, that is the Second Arab-Israel War. Now, what happened was that there was a Yom Kippur War, and it ultimately led to Camp David Accords. In 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. It was a two-sided attack, a two-front attack on Israel from Egypt and Syria, with the understanding to regain the lost territory. Although Israel emerged victorious, but the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, was hailed as a hero because in the earlier phase, what happened in the initial phase of Yom Kippur War, some of the territories which were occupied by Israel were captured by Egypt. So the world and the Arab League nations especially accepted that yes, Egypt or the president Anwar Sadat was hailed to be a hero because he recaptured the territories that were taken by Israel in 1967 war. Now this basically led to multiple disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt, and for the first time, sir, in 1979, Egypt became the first Arab nation in the world to recognize Israel, and this is known as Camp Camp David peace accords that Egypt became the first Arab nation in the world to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. And post that, there are also other countries that have agreed to that, that have accepted that. One was Jordan, which was in 1994, and recently last year Abraham Accords were signed, where two countries, that is UAE and Bahrain, have established diplomatic relations with Israel. So as of now, there are only just 4 nations which have accepted the existence of Israel. One is Egypt, which was under Camp David Accords, second was Jordan, and third is UAE, and fourth is Bahrain. Now, what happened that the Palestinians did not accept this Camp David Accords. They said that Egypt has left us in between and this is not acceptable to us. Now what it led to? It led to First Intifada. This First Intifada was basically because of tension between Israel and Palestine. It escalated over the settlement of West Bank and Gaza Strip. Because what happened was that Israel continued to increase its settlements and there was a continuous fleeing of Palestinians from the lands of West Bank and Gaza Strip. So as Palestinians did not accept that, and there were violent revolts against the Israel settlements, continued increase in Israel settlements, and which is known as First Intifada, which went way back in 1987. Now sir, the world realized that it is very important that there shall be establishment of peace between Israel and Palestine. Now it ultimately led to Oslo Peace Accord. Now Oslo Peace Accord was there with the mediation of USA and Russia in 1993, and this was led by Israel and Palestinian Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat, who was the president of Palestinian Liberation Organization. So in this Oslo Peace Accord, what was established? It accepted the two-state solution. It established the two-state solution, and Palestinian and Israel signed the declaration principles in which both nations seek to recognition of autonomous governing bodies. दोनों ने कहा कि यार there shall be autonomous governing bodies. And sir, what was most significant in this Oslo Peace Accord was that Palestinian Liberation Organization recognized Israel. They accepted, right, there is Israel, that cannot be denied. And also Israel recognized that, or agreed to give independence to the occupied territories. And which are the occupied territories? As we discussed earlier, in 1967 the occupied territories were your Gaza Strip and West Bank. So Israel agreed that they will move back from the occupied territories, and PLO also agreed that there shall be, yes, there is Israel, and they agreed to it. But the Israeli organizations, or the Israel, did not fulfill the Oslo Peace Accords principles. And Israel did not move back. Rather, what Israel did, Israel kind of increased its occupancy in West Bank and Gaza Strip, or the so-called occupied territories. And what it started to increase establishments, it started to build war, and which ultimately led to Second Intifada in 2000, and it continued to 2005. Now this Intifada basically was much more violent as compared to the First Intifada. This Intifada is considered to be a violent uprising, as a lot of people died from both sides in this Second Intifada. Right, now what happened, that for protection of Israel, what Israel did, Israel constructed a West Bank barrier along the West Bank to separate Israel and Palestinian settlements. Rather, on one side, in which Oslo Accords, Israel was saying that it will move out of occupied territories, but rather what Israel did, Israel sir rather established the West Bank barrier, which separated, on one side there were Palestinian settlements, on the other side there were Israeli settlements. So post Second Intifada, or in Second Intifada, which was a violent organization. Now there are two major organizations in Palestine which you must have often heard in news. Now as we know that there were two occupied territories, one is Gaza and second is one is Gaza and second is your West Bank. So in these two organizations, in these two authorities, there are different organizations which are ruling. One is Hamas and second is Fatah. Now Fatah is basically a successor, or is kind of a Palestinian Liberation Organization. This Palestinian Liberation Organization recognizes Israel as per Oslo Peace Accords. Hamas does not recognize. Hamas says we do not recognize Israel. What we want is our free Palestinian land. Now, recently Hamas has also declared that Hamas has also changed its stance, but it is a very small change in stance. What Hamas has agreed to recently is that Hamas said, right, we will accept that there is an existence of Israel, we have no problem with that, but what we also want that Israel goes back to, or the Jewish goes back to its earlier status, that is maximum of the land is occupied by the is under the Palestinians, or the Palestinians are living. Israel goes back to its small bits and pieces where the Jewish settlements were there, that is during the time of 1940s. They want that that status should be again taken back, that Palestinians are occupying the entire territory or living in the entire territory. Israel is living, or the Jews are living in the small settlements. And second important thing that they want, Hamas says, is that the Palestinians should be allowed to be back in Palestine. And third, they say that Israel has to pay for the rehabilitation and the repartition of Israel Palestinians. Now, as all of you know, that this shall not be acceptable to what we say is Israel. Now, when we understand about this Hamas and Fatah, this Fatah is basically the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and this Hamas is a violent organization. It does not have its own military, but yes, it has its kind of armed group of Hamas. Now, Hamas does not accept, as I say, Oslo Peace Accord or two-nation theory, and they control Gaza Strip. Hamas controls this Gaza Strip, a very small piece of land between Egypt and Israel. This very small piece of land, this Gaza Strip, is controlled by Hamas, and this Hamas is supported by Iran. Now it is also being supported by Turkey. Mind you guys that Turkey has a kind of a diplomatic relations with Israel, but recently the president of Turkey, Erdogan, has stated that Israel is a cruel terrorist nation. So now Hamas is also being supported by Iran, it is being supported by Turkey, and it is also being supported by an important nation in West Asia, that is the nation of Qatar. On the other side, there is West Bank. This West Bank is controlled by Fatah. This West Bank is controlled by Fatah. Now, this Fatah or this PLO agrees to what we say is the PLO, or the two-nation theory, or the two-state theory, or the Oslo Peace Accords. And in 2006, what happened, that the conflict between Hamas and Fatah intensified. Ye dono organizations, these organizations represent the Palestinians, but there is no as such peace between them. Hamas does not accept two-nation theory, Fatah accepts two-nation theory. Hamas is a violent group, Fatah is not a violent group. So what happened was that in 2006, there was elections that were held in Gaza Strip, and the elections were won by Hamas. Few seats were won by Fatah as well, but many of the leaders of Fatah who won, they were kind of forced to go to the West Bank, and many were even assassinated. And ultimately, the Gaza Strip came under the entire control of Hamas. But in 2011, there was a reconciliation pact, but it was kind of just a lip service, as there has not been a kind of a significant reconciliation between the two groups, as the two groups have not changed the stance. That is, Hamas and Fatah still continue to control different areas and still continue to have different stance towards Israel. Now, what happened was that we'll understand about the present status of Jerusalem. Now, before that, the area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was recently in news, falls under this territory of Fatah, or West Bank. But now you must have read in newspapers is that the Hamas is fighting the Israeli forces. Now the area has shifted, and now why it has shifted, we'll discuss, and what is the issue about Al-Aqsa Mosque as the present status of Jerusalem. So this is your Al-Aqsa Mosque. As I was telling you earlier as well, that this area of Jerusalem is important for three religions. Now, if you consider this Al-Aqsa Mosque, if you look at this Al-Aqsa Mosque, this area is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This Al-Aqsa Mosque is the holiest site, or one of the most holiest site, for whom it is one of the most holiest site for what we say is the Islam. This dome of rock is holy site for the Jews. It is the holy site for Jews, Dome of Rock. And here where you see this western wall, or this western wall is also known as the Wailing Wall. This western wall is also known as the Wailing Wall, as this area is the area where there is a ruins, or there are ruins of the second ever built mosque, temple for Jews. Now on this part, or in this Wailing Wall or the western wall, a lot of Jews come every year, they pray, and they pray on this side of western wall. And this wall every year, on this Al-Aqsa Mosque every year, especially in the time of Ramzan, a lot of Muslims comes. And this year the problem started in the months of Ramadan. Now what happened, that Israeli forces, or what Israel did, Israel kind of started to barricade this area, and even restricted that there shall not be more than 10,000 people at one time coming to pray in this Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now this was not accepted by the Palestinians, and they said that we go every year to pray. Now what is the problem this year, right? And similarly, Israel stopped and they started to barricade this area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which ultimately led to the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians during the holy month of Ramadan. Now if we talk about the status of Jerusalem, what we need to understand is that Jerusalem was considered to be an international city, as I told you earlier. But in first Arab-Israel war, what happened? Israelis occupied the western half. Right, Israelis captured the western half, and in 6-day war it captured the other half as well. Now Israel considers that complete and unified Jerusalem as its capital. Israel considers that complete and unified Jerusalem is its capital, and similarly the Palestinians consider that the unified Jerusalem is their capital. And sir, one very important thing happened in 2017 when USA recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And it also shifted its embassy, decided that its embassy will be shifted from Tel Aviv, which is the current capital of Israel, to Jerusalem for further significance, right? For further significance, or further USA showing their strength or their support to the Israel. Now, sir, this is the present status of occupation. As you see that in 1947, this green is entirely what we say is the the Palestinian territory. The green area is the Palestinian territory, and जो ये दिख रहे हैं ना आपको छोटे छोटे, है ना, जो कहते हैं ना ऐड आते हैं सर्फ एक्सेल की दाग अच्छे हैं, तो ये जो छोटे छोटे दाग है ना, ये आपके इजराइल है, ये छोटे छोटे spot zone, this is Jewish settlements. But then you consider it partition plan of 1947 given by United Nations. In this partition plan of United Nations, this green area is Palestine, and this entire area was declared to be, or said that it shall be a Jewish state. Now this area continued for 1949 to 67. As you can see, the expansion has increased. Now this is Gaza Strip, and this is West Bank. As you can see, the expansion has increased. These are the only areas left for Palestinians, and rest entirely is the Israeli land. And you look at the present situation, sir. In the present situation, this area, the small green spots, and this area is just the Palestinian territory, and rest everything is Israel. So you see that how Israel's area has increased and how Palestinian area has shrunk. That in this area, जो यहाँ पे in 1947 जो हम Israeli status देख रहे थे, Jewish settlements देख रहे थे Palestine में, now similar is the condition of Palestinians in their own land of Palestine. So this is what is the present status of the Israel and Palestine. Now what is the recent issue that we are going to discuss about, or what led to the problems in the recent times, that there is so much of bombings from one side of Hamas, and Israel has to use its scientific usage, or the strategic weapon of Iron Dome to protect the Israel. So what happened, that the tension, as I was telling you earlier as well, that the tensions began during the Ramzan, in which Israel set up barricades in front of Damascus gates outside the occupied old city, preventing Palestinians from gathering there. Right now, clashes erupted as the Palestinians tried to remove the barricades. So the clashes erupted. Now what happened was that it kind of escalated further, and in this clashes between Palestinian protesters and Israeli police, many people were killed from the sides of Palestinians, and certain Israeli police personnel were also killed, and they were injured. Now this basically led to, and on one side where Israel is stating that the people of Palestine should not come together, or should not gather in large numbers. On the similar side, Israeli authorities gave permission to the Jerusalem Day march. They gave the permission to the Jerusalem Day march, which was done by the far right Zionist group, and they passed through the old quarter city, which there are a lot of Palestinian settlements. Now this ultimately led to the conflict between the two, and Hamas basically issued the understanding, or Hamas basically issued this ultimatum that the Israeli forces should leave from Al-Aqsa Mosque, as Israeli forces captured and entered into Al-Aqsa Mosque, and this was not acceptable to Hamas. They said that Israeli forces should leave Al-Aqsa Mosque, or should leave that corridor, otherwise there shall be repercussions, and they started bombing Israeli areas, which were followed by Israeli strikes. So this basically was the recent issue, and this is continuing as of now as well. Now what is India's stand on Israel-Palestine issue, which is very, very significant? So I told you earlier as well that India has always accepted or talked about two state theory. India recognized Israel in 1950, but it also recognized, it was the first non-Arab country to recognize Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole representative of Palestine, as the sole representative of the Palestinians. India recognized, or India stated, that there shall be a separate territory, or the country's territory, or the separate country territory status to be given to the Palestinian organization. But kind of situation changed. Now the situation primarily changed post 1992, when India for the first time established diplomatic relationship with whom? They established diplomatic relationship with Israel. Post that, India started to de-hyphenate its policies, as it started to have interactions with Israel separately and Palestine separately. So this de-hyphenation was done by Indian side in 1992, and it continues up till now. In 2014, India favored United Nations Human Rights Commission's resolution to probe Israel's human rights violations in Gaza. But post that, India abstained from voting against Israel in 2015. This was considered to be a major shift in India's stance. And in 2019, India voted in favor of decision introduced by Israel in UN Economic and Social Council, that objective granting consultative status to Palestinian non-governmental organization. That Israel stance was favored by India, and in the current situation, that is the present situation, India has said that it requests both the sides to maintain peace and the state go for the solution which is better for both the countries and the people residing in both the countries. So I hope you have understood Israel-Palestine issue. This was it from my side. I hope you continue to study further and stay safe in these times. So all the best, study hard, be safe. Thank you.